But when you're playing a console game, most of them don't really, like for the actual campaign story, aside from games like Gears of War and Halo 2 was the first Halo game that allowed you to have an ally. You don't really get to enjoy the game with another person. So all of that busy work just becomes tedious. It kind of takes away from it. So the whole don't kill peasants and you'll be a good guy, or kill peasants and you'll be a bad guy, I don't buy into it in its current form because I haven't seen it done very well. I've seen it has made some improvements since the original Fable. It was the first game that I really knew that they were trying to do that in, and I think I say that because it was hyped up so much. Like Peter Molyneux and his infamous hyping promises. Oh my gosh.
Yes.
This game was going to be made of gold and you could sail on it in the ocean. It was a good game. I didn't stick with it. I didn't enjoy it as much as I thought I would compared to the hype. Like, I was super excited for the game to come out. And this is another thing. And I think we've said this before. I think that amount of hype really damages the potential of a game.
It certainly can, because it brings up those expectations, and if they're not met...
Yeah, it's like when you go to a movie, but you don't go within the first couple of weeks. Like, you've been excited for this movie all summer. This is going to be the most amazing movie that you're going to see all summer long. You don't go, you let your friends go, and then they come back and like, it was alright. It could have been better. It was just okay. But then you go, and because they've actually lowered your expectations through word of mouth, you think it's better than what they think.
Exactly.
So it's one of those perception as far as hype goes. So I think hyping a game is dangerous. I think hyping a movie is dangerous. There is no one game, there is no one movie that is going to be the end-all, be-all of its genre.
No. There may be something that sets the benchmark for a few years. But
Exactly. Benchmark is good. Street Fighter did that.
Yes.
Street Fighter set a certain
Street
level
Fighter
for
2.
fighting games. Yeah, Street Fighter 2. Yeah, you're right. Street Fighter 1. Yeah.
You played that?
Yeah, exactly. Street Fighter 2 did set a level, a benchmark. If your fighting game can't do some of these things, don't bother putting it out because it's not going to live up to expectations. And I think right now World of Warcraft is pretty much the benchmark for MMOs.
Yep.
I think games like Call of Duty is a benchmark for first-person shooters.
Yep.
Yeah, and I don't think so anymore, but at one point Final Fantasy was the benchmark for RPGs.
Yep. For Japanese RPGs, anyway.
Right,
American audiences tend to favor the likes of Baldur's Gate and
Dungeons and Dragons.
Dungeon Siege, Diablo. I'm trying to think of an actual RPG though. Baldur's Gate's the only one that's coming to mind. Dragon Age, but that's a lot more recent. I'm trying to think back in the day.
Really have a lot of American RPGs back then.
They were around, they were just more action-oriented.
Well, it is something to be said about the way we live our lives, too. I like more active games.
Mm-hmm.
I don't like to sit down, and this is probably why I don't play RPGs anymore. I don't like to just sit down and wander through a cave and not be able to see the enemies, and then suddenly I'm in a fight, and then I just press the A button a whole bunch of times so that I attack, and then I move on. It's kind of boring, not as rewarding, and I did this all the time. I loved Final Fantasy VI. That is my favorite Final Fantasy game. I never used my magic abilities because I was worried I would get to the boss and then not have any mana. So the games that actually allow you to use them in the fight without punishing you too much in the long run, I think are better. It makes the experience better because then it feels a little bit, it's not really, you're not doing anything different, but you feel a little more engaged. There's more going on the screen at once. It's a little bit more colorful, more explodey, that kind of stuff.
Involved with the action.
Yeah, there you go, involved, there you go. But I think we went off on another tangent there.
Well, actually, turning things on its ear, how RPGs are commonly known, and even the whole thing we were talking about bad guys in video games, there is an RPG that I've been aware of for a very long time. I have never seen an English version of it, and I have this horrible feeling I never will. But if anybody has ever heard of Moon, that is one of the most original ideas I've heard for an RPG. And it's so simple and yet so complex. Basically, Moon, also known as Remix RPG Adventure, it starts the game as you're basically a kid playing an RPG, called Moon on his game station. So you've got this little mini game of you doing all the stuff, and it's very Dragon Warrior / Dragon Questy, where it's doing all the stuff that you would expect from an NES or early SNES RPG, where you're going around, you're fighting the monsters, you're getting your items, you're looting chests out of places, and more or less, during the course of the game, he wakes up inside the game. Now, this may sound Captain-ish, but here's where it gets interesting. The actual idea of what's going on here is that the hero of the game is not so much of a hero. So you're going around trying to recover the souls of these poor creatures this guy's been using to level up with. You're trying to get back the items this guy stole from out of people's houses. And it's taking all of the concepts that we know about RPGs and kind of reversing them of, this guy's a bit of a jerk.
That sounds pretty interesting, actually.
Yeah, it does.
And it's a PS1 game that came out like, 97, 98. So it's been out for ages, and it's never been remade as far as I know, and certainly never been put into the English language. And it's a shame because I've never heard anything like this. And it's one of those RPGs I've always wanted to play simply because that premise is so different.
Yeah, it's interesting. Some of the things you talk about, like taking the items back from the person that stole them out of the houses, because it's what we do in RPGs. It seems like I've heard about it. It was just one of those things that I probably didn't pay a lot of attention to, which I should have, because that sounds pretty amazing.
It's actually probably a lot more complicated and interesting than even I'm aware of. It's just, this is stuff that I've picked up over the years of hearing about the game and watching a few plays of it, which I'm hoping to get some video here. We'll see what happens. But since we're probably getting low on time, I want to go into one last question for you guys. And what is the best video game story that you recall? Or just best video game moment that just stood out for you that has like a story element to it?
Dysentery? I don't know.
Something really memorable to you. For example, I'll start. Chrono Trigger and Final Fantasy VI had two of the really greatest stories out there. Their characters were really deep for as the era they were in, where everything was so cliche. And I guess Chrono Trigger did kind of fall into the cliche quite often. But the way it was handled, it really came together well. In Final Fantasy VI, you know, I'm not totally sure I like Kefka so much since of how I'm seeing him portrayed more recently in games like Dissidia. But talk about a bad guy of all bad guys. He completed everything he sought to do before he was defeated. You can't say that about too many bad guys in video games. He plunged the world into chaos just like he wanted, and it stayed that way for a while.
It did. My picks would be similar to yours. I would also pick Final Fantasy VI for the same reasons. It had an amazing... I probably played through the game. Not all the way through, but I've started the game at least 5 times. And I love the game. I love the characters in the game. Edgar was one of my favorite characters.
Yes.
And we always called him Goo, but I think you say his name Gao.
Yeah, I've always called him Gao. I think it is Gao.
We always had a joke we would call him Goo because none of us could figure out how to pronounce it, so it was like, hey Goo. But anyway, that game, and I would pick Chrono Cross over Chrono Trigger. Just because I like the characters in Chrono Cross. Well, not all of them, but I really liked Robo and Chrono Trigger, but I don't like Frog as much as most people do. I liked Kid and Lynx and Surge. I really liked those characters.
They had some interesting stuff going on there. No spoilers, though, just in case.
Yeah, and I think that they did make some references to Chrono Trigger, so I think that also heightened my appreciation for it over Chrono Trigger, because it referenced Chrono Trigger. So imagine that one. I think those would be my two, Chrono Cross and Final Fantasy VI.
I think my favorite one was The Legend of Legaia. That was on the PlayStation 1.
That was a good one. I have that, yeah.
Pulled me in, and Final Fantasy X was one of the major ones that pulled me in. I remember just playing the holy crap out of that Blitzball they had on there. I mean, I wanted to make a Blitzball game. I was just like, just make a Blitzball game and I'll play it.
That's strange, because a lot of people complained about that. They hated the Blitzball game.
I loved that Blitzball game.
Were you ever able to beat that first match that you weren't really supposed to win?
I did. I beat that match.
I did too.
It's awesome getting Waka that trophy.
Yep.
I want to also give an honorary mention to BioShock, largely because there's not a lot of games that have a really good twist ending. And I have not played through BioShock entirely myself. I played it for a little while. Matter of fact, I think it was your copy, Mike, that I was playing. And it wasn't a bad game by any standards, it's just it wasn't really my thing. Which is kind of strange because it borrows so much about how Half-Life worked. But I didn't feel the same kind of immersion with it. It felt too video gamey to me, and it was hard for me to get into it, despite how fantastic the setting was. But the twist ending to that, that was a thumbs up. I did not see that coming.
Now that you've mentioned it, and you've got me thinking, because I was thinking about previous generation only, not this gen. But I think that was like when I realized what was going on. That was like, I hate this guy now. Like I don't even think when Sephiroth killed Eris, I wasn't as mad.
I never understood why people got upset about that, because it was far from the first time that a character had sacrificed themselves in a game setting. Final Fantasy IV had how many of them? How many of them technically died in the course of Final Fantasy IV?
Quite a few.
At least,
granted, they all came back.
At least 6.
But still. And technically, Eris did too, in her own little way. But I think the way Eris died seems so senseless. There seemed to be no plot reason why she needed to die there. And I think that's what took everybody so off guard.
I mean, so many characters died in most of the Final Fantasies. I mean, at least a couple.
Well,
starting
Final Fantasy X, there was a couple of characters in that one that kind of met a demise before the end of it.
Or they were already dead.
Oh, spoilers.
Yeah.
Once again, everybody should have played that was going too far.
Yeah. Well, there's ways to complete Final Fantasy VI without certain characters alive as well.
Suikoden has quite a few deaths in the first and second one, and there are ways of saving the characters, which is interesting. Both of these characters are really major characters that have a really meaningful death that were every bit as much of an impact to the game as Eris's, or Aerith, if you're used to the new Japanese pronunciation of it.
Yeah.
Breath of Fire 2 had one like that as well. The father, if you could kill the main character's father completely by accident, not even realize that was him.
Talos is nothing terribly new in games. I think it's a lot in the way it's presented and how you frame it up to that point. Because if it's a character you're not going to care about, it's not going to be that big of a deal when they die. It's kind of also like the Call of Duty. One of the reasons why Modern Warfare, the first one, got a lot of sudden interest was out of the way it handled its characters. One of the characters you play actually dies in the course of the game, a rather horrific death, and it's portrayed there right in front of you. You're controlling him in his last moments. And that was kind of an unsettling moment for a lot of people.
When that happened in that game, I was like, I think I did something wrong. I missed something. This wasn't supposed to happen. Because I reset that mission just to see if there was another way I could do it, and there wasn't.
Nope.
That's what happens.
But we're probably way over time.
I think so.
Well, that was pretty much our show for this week. It might be running a little long, but I hope you enjoyed the show. We got on some weird tangents there. I hope you'll join us next week. I'm Chris.
I'm Mike.
I'm Grover.
And we'll see you next week.
Goodbye.
Later.
That's not how we usually do that, is it?